Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's topic is Unlocking Leadership, Keys to Success for Women in Education. My name is Kathleen Arney, and I serve as the Senior Policy Analyst on the K-12 team here at the Hunt Institute. For those of you unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term governor from North Carolina, Jim Hunt. We serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues from prenatal to higher education. We offer in-person and virtual convenings, conduct research, and offer other forms of technical assistance to states across the country. Before we jump in, I want to provide a brief logistical overview of how we'll spend our time together this afternoon. We'll start with a panel discussion before pivoting to a Q&A with our audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the discussion. We will be recording today's conversation, and in the next few days, we'll post it to our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to join us on X, formerly known as Twitter, where you can participate in the conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. Let's jump in. Today, we are joined by Commissioner Cordova, the State Commissioner for the Colorado Department of Education, Kristen Wynn, the head of AIM Institute for Learning and Research, Emily Hartnett, the Executive Director for Women Leading Ed, and Dr. Juliana Horowitz, the Senior Associate Director for the Pew Center Research Center. All of our panelists have impressive careers in education and academia, and we're thrilled to have them join and share their insights and expertise. As our panelists know, leadership is not a one-size-fits-all experience, especially for women. Today, we will explore the diverse and evolving pathways to leadership in education with our panelists who have forged their own unique routes to success in the field. Dr. Horowitz, we'll begin with you. The Pew Research Center shared an article on public perceptions of women in political leadership ahead of the 2024 election cycle. What can this tell us about gender disparities in leadership? And what does the public think about those disparities?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for including me in this event. I'm very excited to be here, and I look forward to the questions from the audience also. So every couple of years we do a study on the public's perceptions of the state of women in political and business leadership, and also the obstacles that the public perceives women as facing, and when it comes to getting to the highest levels of leadership in their fields. And one of the things we know from looking at the data on women in leadership positions is that women have made significant gains in recent decades, but they still lag behind men in lots of different ways. When we look at the House and Senate, when we look at state legislatures, governorships, as well as Fortune 500 boards and CEOs. And while we at the Pew Research Center haven't done research necessarily on K through 12 leadership, we have looked at college presidents. And so as of 2 years ago, when we last updated our numbers, 33% of college presidents were women. So women lag behind in higher ed as well. In terms of the survey, one of the things that we find is that a narrow majority of Americans think that there are too few women in top leadership positions in politics and in business, and a sizable share, close to 40%, say it's about right. And then under 10% say that there are too many women in these positions. And then in terms of the obstacles that people think women face, it's interesting because overall, majority, and especially when we ask about business leadership, majority of Americans say that a major obstacle for women in getting to the top positions is that women are held to a different standard than men. They have to do more to prove themselves than men do. And many also say women face discrimination when it comes to politics, that parties just don't offer the same amount of support to women. But we see huge gender disparities in these answers. And so women are a lot more likely than men to say that these are major obstacles for women in leadership. So just to give you a couple of examples from the data, 71% of women say that a major reason why there aren't more women in top business leadership positions is that women have to do more to prove themselves than men. And just 43% of men think that that's a major obstacle for women. Similarly, 59% of women say women face gender discrimination in getting to these positions, and just 39% of men think that that's the case. And the reason we see some of these disparities in perceptions has to do, at least in part, with experiences that women have had in the workplace, regardless of whether or not they're in these top positions. So when we've done research on experiences in the workplace overall, again, even for women who are not at the top, who are not bosses or not managers, that women are so much more likely than men to say that they personally have had experiences where in the workplace where they felt like they were treated like they weren't smart, or they were treated like their contributions didn't matter, or felt like they've been passed up for promotions because of their gender. And so, people are bringing their own experiences to these attitudes about top leadership. And one thing that'd be interesting, and again, I'm hoping maybe someone on the panel has an answer to this, but we haven't done work on K through 12 leadership in particular. But I do wonder, in a field where the pipeline does tend to tilt more heavily female, what does that look like? What do these experiences in the workplace for women who are not yet at the top positions, and as they seek those positions, what does that look like in a field that is more dominated by women, at least in some tiers of that field? And so I think that would be something really interesting to explore more.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz. I think grounding this conversation in data is very helpful. So we'll move to Emily. Women Leading Ed empowers women to seek leadership in education roles at the state and district levels. Tell us a bit about how Women Leading Ed does this and how your model ensures women leaders have the support and tools they need to succeed and advance their careers.
Absolutely. So Women Leading Ed is the nation's largest nonprofit network dedicated to advancing women in education leadership, bringing together now over 500 district and state commissioners, charter school leaders, and C-suite executives across all 50 states. Collectively, our members serve more than 18 million students, which is 1 in 3 public school students nationwide. And we were founded with a simple but urgent mission to identify, to develop, and to really sustain the next generation of education leaders by unlocking talent that we believe is what we say hiding in plain sight. And our model is built on a few core strategies, not only to help support women's leadership, but also actively break down barriers that may hold them back. One, we create really intentional support systems. So many of us know leadership can be really isolating, especially for women and particularly women of color in male-dominated spaces. And Women Leading Ed fosters meaningful connections through coaching, through sponsorship. We've built a strong network of women leaders across the country who can turn to one another, who can depend on one another, who can go to one another for advice, and who can also really push one another forward in the service of students. Second, we provide targeted development and supports focused on leadership skills that women are less likely to receive support or training in. Research shows that women receive less training in areas such as negotiation, financial management, operational leadership, skills that are essential for that top role. We're working to change that. As an example, in just 1 year, we have doubled the percentage of our women members who've received negotiation training, which is equipping them with the tools they need to better negotiate contracts and services for their students that they serve. That's really important as we think about opening up additional pathways into leadership for women. Third, we really think about systemic change, and we use data and research, like was mentioned before, to highlight challenges that do exist and really to make them real. Our research, including both the Superintendent Research Project, and I'll talk a little bit later, hopefully, about our annual Insight Survey, shine light on the realities that exist in education leadership, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And this research really fuels our recommendations into what one can do. I think what sets us apart and how we're able to really support women is that we're not thinking just about how to navigate the system, but also just redesign it. Like, strong networks aren't a luxury, they're a necessity. Women deserve them. Women have the skills, the access, the opportunities, and they've earned. And when we get there, we all win, particularly students who need access to and deserve incredible leaders. So we believe really that the talent is already here in women leaders, the ambition is here, and that's why we're really here supporting women to move into those positions and to sustain in them.
Thank you, Emily. I really appreciated that piece you pulled out about the connection and community it takes. At the Hunt Institute, we say that we're conveners at heart, so we can definitely resonate with that message. Kristen, your career has taken you from the classroom to the school district to the Mississippi Department of Education, and now you lead the AIM Institute for Learning and Research, which provides leadership to states across the country in implementing evidence-based reading practices. How have you leveraged your expertise to bring leadership to a national organization?
Thank you for that question. And I do want to thank you for inviting me to this conversation and being part of this wonderful panel. So my background as a former state literacy director, as well as a school and district leader and a Black educator and leader in this space, has really positioned me to really advocate and drive systemic changes and with the emphasis on equity and improving reading skills for students. So I've leveraged that experience and my experience from the classroom to my experience to the district level and the state level, and now this position at AIM to really focus on 6 really key areas. One being policy to practice. My experience has shaped in shaping and implementing literacy policy in Mississippi has given me this insight into the gaps between research, the policy, the practice, and the classroom. So I, try to leverage this leadership experience to bridge the gap to ensuring these policies really, really translate into meaningful professional learning and instructional support for our educators. The next area is around equity and advocacy. My leadership experience has really shaped my commitment to equitable access to high quality instruction, particularly for historically underserved communities and marginalized students. It has allowed me to elevate this conversation nationally around literacy reform and around ensuring that there are solutions that are culturally responsive and inclusive of all students. Also, I really do understand the power of professional learning in transforming teacher knowledge and student outcomes, and how professional learning can also impact teacher retention. So my position at AIM, in that leadership role, it gives me the ability to scale those literacy-based training nationally and draw on the success and challenges that I've been able to participate in Mississippi. And then anytime we're in this leadership role as women, and in general, when you're having, long-term leadership, you've been in a process for several years, you build and maintain relationships. And I have built over the years these valuable relationships with state leaders, district leaders, organizations across the country. And so it helps to advance the mission and advance my commitment to equity and advocacy around the professional learning opportunities and supporting policy efforts aligned to the science of reading. And then one of the most important things to me in this space as a Black woman in leadership is representation. And I do not take for granted being a mentor and inspiring other leaders of culture. So I do understand visibility in this space to help break those barriers and create mentorship opportunities for emerging leaders, ensuring that diverse voices are present in these decision-making processes. And then just in general, the influence on literacy reform. my previous positions, which I'm so grateful for each and every opportunity, has really prepared me to contribute to the national discussion around literacy instruction. I have a son that's dyslexic, so I really advocate for supports for students with dyslexia and learning disabilities, and then teacher preparation. This my role has, or my various roles have allowed me to advocate for best practices and influence national organization, policymakers, and educators to prioritize effective literacy instruction.
Kristen, thank you for those powerful 6 ideas there, especially for highlighting the importance and impact of representation and leadership, and particularly in bringing that to the important work that is literacy. So thank you very much. Commissioner Cordova, you have spent over 30 years in education, holding a variety of different roles, including leading 2 large districts before becoming the first Latina to hold the commissioner's office in Colorado. Tell us a bit about your journey and what support you had or wished you'd had to reach this level of leadership.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's such good timing for me to have this conversation. Yesterday, I did a podcast with the principal at the high school I graduated from. And so I've spent the last couple of days just really reflecting on what it was like to be a high school student here in my hometown of Denver, to be the first person in my family to go to college, got a scholarship to go to college, and then to make my way back into that same district as a teacher. And probably at every step along the way, what was so important to me when I think about my high school experience, my early career as a teacher, how I became a school leader, was there was somebody who went out of their way to tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, you should think about, when I was in high school, it was like, hey, you should think about applying for this scholarship to a private college, which I probably wouldn't have done if a teacher hadn't gone out of their way to say that. When I was in college, somebody saying, hey, you should think about becoming a teacher. When I was a teacher, somebody saying, hey, you should think about looking into school leadership. And it was really every step along the way that people, tapped me on the shoulder and said, you should think about doing this thing. I see something in you that would make you a good person to do this. And almost never did I think of that for myself. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do for young people is to help them see a version of themselves that they may not be aware of, they may not think of. It was so powerful for me to have people pave the way because I didn't have anybody who went to college in my family. I didn't know what it was going to be like. And so to have somebody pave the way for me around that was really important. I didn't know anybody who had gone to graduate school, who had taken those steps. And so to have not just the mentors, but the people who are going to sponsor you and help you pave that pathway, it makes a huge difference to me. And probably the thing that I wish that I had had somebody say to me, and I wish, like the lesson I feel like I've spent my life working on is don't let fear stop you from doing things. I I've been a big reader of the Stoics, and so it's like all of the time that I spent in earlier versions of my life on regret and like rehashing mistakes of the past. I really wish I could have told my younger self, don't bother, like learn, for sure learn, but don't bother relitigating and rehashing the mistakes. And then all of the time and sleepless nights I spent on worrying about what's coming in the future and the fear that sometimes really stopped me from doing things. I wish that I had the advice to like live in the moment and don't let fear stop you from doing things that you should probably do.
Thank you. Those are some excellent words of advice. And I especially appreciate your point about mentorship, sponsorship, and the folks who just recognize potential in you, right? Those are particularly helpful folks. Thank you. Dr. Horowitz, we'll come back to you. We know that experiences early on in life shape expectations of adulthood. What do we know about boys and girls taking on leadership positions in early ages?
Sorry, I was just trying to mute. So, as part of that same survey that we did on perceptions of women in top positions of leadership, we also asked US adults to reflect on their own experiences growing up and the extent to which they took on leadership positions in their school and their communities. And we do find a difference between men and women, with men being more likely than women to say that they often took on those roles. But one thing that's really interesting is that we don't see that same gender gap among young adults. So among those 18 to 29, men and women are equally likely to say they took on leadership roles often in their community, which maybe means that something's changing. It remains to be seen if how that's going to continue. But I thought that was a really interesting finding. And I really love that Commissioner Cordova mentioned the encouragement, because that's also reflected in the data. One of the things that we asked about was the extent to which people were encouraged we asked separately about their parents and family members, and then about teachers, coaches, and other adults in their life, the extent to which those adults encouraged them to take on leadership roles when they were younger, when they were growing up. And about a third say that they were highly encouraged by their parents and other adult family members, and about the same share say that they were highly encouraged by teachers, coaches, and other adults in their life. And we see a strong correlation between being encouraged by these adults to take on leadership roles and actually doing it. And again, just to give an example from the data, 38% of those who said that they were encouraged, at least a fair amount, said that they often took on those roles. But among those who just got some encouragement, but not a lot of encouragement, 10% say they took on those roles. And those who had no encouragement, 3% of them say that they took on those roles. So even the difference, it's a big difference between those who got, some encouragement doesn't necessarily get kids to take on these leadership roles, but those who are highly encouraged. And so, so we really do see that in the data, that having that mentorship, having someone who believes in you and somebody who says, I see something in you, and you should go for this, and you should give it a try, that's really important. But I will say one thing that is interesting is that while we see that gender gap in the shares of men and women who say that they took on leadership roles when they were growing up, we don't see a difference in the share saying that they were encouraged to do it. And so it's interesting because there is a correlation between being encouraged and actually doing it. That doesn't seem to necessarily explain the differences in participation in leadership positions growing up between men and women. And so there's more work that needs to be done, and more research that we need to do to really understand at what point do these paths sort of diverge for men and women, and at what point, if they, at least looking back, they feel like they were encouraged to the same extent, why did men then go on to participate in these positions more so than women, and why do we see the disparities that we see when we get to business and politics and higher ed and some of the other things that we have talked about in terms of leadership in those fields. So but I always like it when I see a connection between people's experiences, lived experiences, and what we see in the data, and that's one where things really do match up.
Thank you. I was gonna call that out as well. I really appreciate that connection there with the importance of encouragement and the nuance. So thank you for adding that perspective. Emily, we'll come back to you. Women Leading Ed just released their 2025 update to the Insight Survey, which explores bias in education leadership. What does this data tell us about the representation in education leadership?
Thank you. And I'm excited to sort of continue this of the data and the experiences, because that's really what the Insight Survey does. So in short, it confirms what too many women in education leadership already know, that bias isn't present, but it's also persistent. We're not really seeing change. So in the Insight Survey, we survey women education leaders from across the country. And this year's respondents, about a third, were sitting district or state superintendents, and the rest are at various levels of LEA and SEA leadership. Survey findings were clear. One, and I want to start with the quantitative is that we already know from our superintendent research project that women are still dramatically underrepresented in top leadership roles in education. Despite making up almost 80% of the teaching workforce, we have found that only about 30% of the women hold only about 30% of superintendent positions in the nation's largest top 500 school districts. And that number has not budged in almost a decade. But we also know from our Insight survey that it's not about a lack of ambition, and obviously not about qualifications. In fact, one of the stats in our survey is that 82% of women superintendents reported that they had to make personal or professional sacrifices that their male colleagues did not. And yet, they're still passed over for leadership opportunities. In addition to this, and sort of building on it, women in leadership face different and often unfair expectations. An overwhelming 86% of survey respondents reported feeling pressure to dress, speak, and behave in specific or different ways because they are women. And that's an increase from last year's already very high 82% who indicated as such. That bias extends to personal matters as well. Of the superintendents who completed the survey, 22% were explicitly asked about their family or caregiving responsibilities in their interview for that top seat, something that male applicants are rarely asked about. And for superintendents, 76% feel that their decisions are second-guessed much more often than their male peers. We're also seeing that bias impacts career pathways. Like I mentioned before, women are routinely steered away from financial and operational leadership roles, the very experiences that lead to those top positions. And it's clear that women aren't just not being given the same opportunities than their male counterparts. And those biases that we're seeing overall take a really serious toll as well. On the survey, only 40% of women rated their physical and mental health as good or very good. 58% are considering leaving their positions due to stress. That number jumps to 63% when you look at just superintendents. It's not just a personal cost, it's a systemic risk that threatens the entire educational leadership pipeline. It really threatens, as we think about incredible leaders that are leading districts and students and the impact it'll have there. As we think about this, like the bottom line, it's not a talent gap. It's not an ambition gap. It's that systemic bias problem that exists. And until we fix it, we're shortchanging not just women leaders who could and are qualified and ready to move into these positions, but we're depriving millions of students from having access to these exceptional leaders because of this inherent bias that exists.
Whew. Thank you, Emily. That is some very stark data to sit with, I think. I'm hoping that two of our panelists will maybe have some insight or advice for us on how to navigate some of those challenges. So Commissioner Cordova and Kristen, Commissioner Cordova, we'll start with you. What advice do you have for young women aspiring to leadership positions in education, particularly those who feel daunted by the lack of women at the top levels of their field?
So interesting to think about this question. And Emily, while I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think about my 24-year-old daughter. I have a daughter who's like in her first big job, not in education, but in a very male-dominated field. And she has a long commute. And so I talked to her on her drive home. And a lot of what I'm encouraging her to do is like find your executive voice and speak up. And, you know, when the environment around you is exhibiting, you know, attributes that are inappropriate, speak up. And, you know, you don't have to be ugly about it, but there's nobody in 2025 who doesn't know what appropriate office behavior is like. And I think it's just, you know, especially in male-dominated fields where people feel like they can just do that, and you really can't. And I think it's really important that our young women find their voice, get comfortable with that voice, and then use that voice. It's such an important lesson to learn in those early jobs. Another thing I'm talking with her about is you got to really get good at your stuff. And in the early stages of your career, you just got to know you're going to make mistakes. And being able to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, like I said before, like spend less time in regrets and more time in learning is going to be really important, because there's no young leader who goes into a big leadership job and doesn't screw things up. Like, we all have done that. And so, like, get your group of people around you who are going to lift you up and help you out. And then, I would say the other thing that I would say for women in particular, like, there are all the messages that come to us from the workplace and from, you know, um, the environment. But then there are, like, the messages I think that we've internalized forever. And it's things like, I have to take my kids to the doctor. I'm the one who has to clean the house. I have to know what's going on with the laundry. And, like, as soon as you can afford to have somebody else help you with that, do it. Like, don't clean your house before they come to clean your house. Like, give yourself permission to do the things that allow you to be the leader that you need to be. Set the boundaries where you can spend time with your family. And I think it's unrealistic to think that you can do it all at the same time. And so it's like, outsource the laundry, figure out some way to make dinners easier. Like, some of those things that I think as women, we feel obligations around and a lot of guilt around. We just got to figure out how to make that easier.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that kind of callback to some of the personal costs of leadership, and maybe getting creative about those solutions. Kristen, I'll ask you the same question. What advice do you have for young women aspiring to leadership positions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Emily, your data really drove home, because a lot of times in this space, I can speak as a woman, but also can speak as a Black woman. And a lot of times we're overlooked, even though we are well qualified. Um, and my advice for young women who are aspiring to be in this leadership role, especially in education, would be own your own experience and your story. We have lived experience. I come to this space with lived experiences that nobody can take away from me. Your culturally your cultural perspective matters, and your professional insights are valuable assets. And so don't let anyone diminish those accomplishments, those insights, and those perspectives. Um, I would also say you have to speak boldly. You know, I'm always reminded of this quote, and I tell young women this all the time. Well-behaved women rarely make history. So be bold in your thinking, um, and be bold in your commitment to what you want to see change in this world. I have also been fortunate in this space to have some incredible mentors and sponsors, people who've stepped up and said, you know, I've gone through certain things that I don't want to see that. I think that's important for women to seek those mentors and seek those guides, whether it's in education, leadership, um, or whatever position you may be in. And then you need a network. Build a relationship with like-minded professionals who can offer you the support, who can share that knowledge, who are able to open doors for you to, you know, push you into spaces, in these uncomfortable spaces that you may not have seen yourself in. But sometimes people see things in you that you don't necessarily see in yourself. And then as you're climbing, what I do see a lot of times in this space, sometimes we make it to the top and we don't pull others up. I think it's so important in this space that we leverage leadership for systemic change. As you move up into your leadership world, how are you lifting up and creating additional opportunities for other women? I always want to be uh, in a position where I am creating other opportunities and positions for those coming alongside me or coming behind me. And then visualize yourself as a leader, as a young inspired. I mean, where do you see yourself? How do you set that course and stay the course? You know, if leadership opportunities seem scared, don't be scared. Don't be discouraged. Stay focused on your mission and how you want to make the world a better place. And I'll close with saying this: give yourself grace and space. And it's okay not to know everything. Leadership is a journey and not this arrival or this destination that I've arrived because I'm in this position. You don't have all the answers. And I tell my colleagues all the time, I don't have all the answers. So I try to be really good and intentional about distributive leadership and us working together, learning. I always say adapt and overcome. So I learn, adapt, and I keep growing and try to overcome and adjust and be flexible in my leadership. So, you know, if I had to give that advice, that's what the advice that I would give young leaders.
Thank you, Kristen. Those are some excellent pieces of advice. I particularly appreciate you lifting up, owning your experience, right? And women, and especially women of color, have valuable experiences to share and stories to tell. So thank you very much. Now's the time that we will open it up to our audience. Please remember to send us your questions in the Q&A, and we will tackle our first question from our audience. So our first question is, what role does self-advocacy play in career advancement for women in education? How can women better advocate for themselves without facing backlash? I'll open it up to the panel.
I'll take a stab at that, and then it looks like Emily might want to say something also. It seems to me like one of the things that's really important in terms of self-advocacy is to make sure you really know what your strengths are, what your skills are, and what your worth is. And like making sure you have a good understanding of advocacy around, salary negotiations is a really important thing. Like, what is an appropriate salary? um what do you bring to the table in terms of your skills, your experiences, your reach, to be able to advocate for things like that. But I would also say it's like, how do you advocate for the opportunities, like the stretch opportunities that will position you to get into the right places? So many times I look back at my career, it was my willingness to do things that were not my job that actually positioned me to get the next job. And so I think it's really important to think about advocacy, not just in like the salary or negotiation space, but like, how do you get the opportunities to take on higher profile experiences, both that when I look back, it's like I learned so much from, and it helped me build a body of experiences and track record that really positioned me well for the next step.
I'm happy to jump in, and Commissioner, that aligns so well with what I was thinking of. We often see that women are hesitant to even apply or put themselves out for the next role. And I think we've all heard, like, women wait to check the box for every single thing on the job description, where others are like, oh, I got like 50% of this, like, I'm going for it. And like shifting some of that mindset and really taking that risk into knowing that you are prepared, you are qualified, and you are ready. And it's you, and it's like your self-doubt that sometimes holds you back. So putting yourself out there, taking the risk, and knowing that it may be a push, and it should be a push from what you're doing now, and that is growth. And that challenge and that gap is where you turn to your network and where you turn to those who will help uplift you and really push you forward and will be there when you make the mistakes, like Commissioner said, everyone makes in leadership. But as Kristen also said, like making sure you have your sponsors along the way who are going to give you real feedback and continue to propel you forward is really what a lot of what we think about of that self-advocacy. But you need the people in your corner to help push you forward, and you need to be able to take those risks.
Yeah, can I just add to Emily's thought? You know, I'm always reminded of perfection is the enemy of good enough. And I think just piggybacking off what Emily said, a lot of times women, we don't take that risk because we feel like we don't check all the boxes off. But it's okay if you don't. And I think a part of advocating for yourself is also saying and being very honest and truthful up front to say, I don't know everything, but my experiences are important and I do know enough and I'm willing to learn and to grow in that particular space. And again, I cannot stress the fact of, it's so important to have people poured into you that have, been in the space that you're trying to get into. But then I think even when applying for positions and advocating for yourself, or when you're getting in these positions, just being upfront to say, I don't know everything, but I'm willing to grow and I'm willing to learn. And I have a track record of being able to learn, grow, and overcome some of those things that I may not have experiences with, to be the best leader that I can be.
Thank you all. Our next question is, what policies or initiatives have proven effective in supporting women to rise through the ranks in education leadership?
One of the things that we have seen is one really intentional data collection on who's actually in the seat. This is why we created the Superintendent Research Project, is because we realized that at a national level, there was no openly, publicly available data set of who's actually leading the largest school districts. And that's a huge gap. Having worked in schools and districts previously, we report on students and teachers, but not on leaders. And I think the first step is really thinking about who is in those leadership positions. And I would say that one of the initiatives that we've really been encouraging states to think about is that data collection and understanding, both with race, gender, et cetera, of who's in leadership, not just name of the superintendents, which obviously exist, but more. And really taking an honest look at who is leading and other attributes about where they are leading, in different sections of the state, in different geographies, et cetera. So that's one. And then two, I would really think also about intentional succession planning and development of those on one's team. None of us are going to be in the position that we're in forever, and that is a good thing. But really thinking intentionally as a leader, and if you're on board and thinking about your leader and that you're supporting and sort of all of the layers here, about what the plan is for developing that next layer and being the sponsor for leaders that you are managing and that you are supporting either internally or externally from your organization. And what's going to happen next? In order to continue and keep initiatives and progress moving for students, we need to think beyond all of us. And we really need to think about that long term of who is coming next and how we can best support them and develop them so that they are able to take our seat or other seats of leadership and continue to propel the work forward for students.
One of the policies that was really effective for me when I was in a district was the district's investment in grow your own strategies. And so the idea that I was able, I was a young mom transitioning from teaching into school leadership. I was able to get both financial support to complete a principal licensure program and a master's degree, time off from work to be able to do that, as well as time on weekends when I needed to do it. I don't know if I would have been able to take on that kind of commitment if I hadn't gotten that time out off work and the financial support to be able to do that. And I think it's a really important investment in in all of our people, but particularly when we're trying to create leadership that reflects the demographics of our school districts, to invest in those kind of grow your own programs.
Thank you both. I think thinking, as we kind of mentioned earlier, in a systemic way is very helpful in terms of tackling some of these bigger issues. Dr. Horowitz, we'll come back to you. What does the Pew Research data say about how Americans see differences in how the media treats men and women, particularly in political office? And what traits do Americans think impacts a woman's chance of being elected, specifically thinking about those elected positions in education leadership?
And I mean, like, I'm not in education. And so a lot of the questions on education policy and some of these questions I can't answer. And even this question about how the media treats women running for office, or the sort of the characteristics and the qualities that Americans think help or hurt women, even though we did it in the context of political leadership, I think it's very relevant to the conversation that we're having, because I think it touches on a lot of the things that other speakers have mentioned. I mean, in terms of how the media treats candidates, I mean, in general, both for male and female candidates, there's a perception that the media doesn't focus enough on the substantive things, that there's more of a focus on physical appearance, personality, both for men and women. People think the media focuses too much on these things and not enough on people's, candidates' views on key policies or ability to solve the country's problems. But much more so, Americans think that's the case when it comes to how the media covers women running for office. And so 62% say the media focuses too much on the physical appearance of women. 47% say that the media focuses too much on their personality. And then similarly, people think that being assertive is a trait that hurts women in politics, and that showing emotions hurts women more than it hurts men. And I think that, some of these things, having children is something that people see as hurting women's chances when they're running for office more so than men. And I think some of these things also play out in some of the things that other panelists have mentioned, in terms of when women are going for these positions, or where they're coming up through the ranks in their workplaces, that they are still judged sometimes not on substance, but on these other things that are not related to how they perform their job, whether it's their personality or their appearance. And even this notion of that assertiveness is something that is helpful to men who are leaders, but that is judged negatively when it comes to women. And just thinking about what Commissioner Cordova was talking about earlier, in terms of women, young women in particular, finding their voices, and that it's important. Sometimes we will be thought of as too aggressive, or to this or to that, but it is important for to push through, because that is a perception that the public has of women in leadership positions, but that it is important to not let those perceptions get in the way of people actually going for the things that they're highly qualified for.
Thank you for that. Being fearless, I think, as Commissioner Cordova mentioned earlier. I appreciate that. Kind of related, I think, this is one of our questions from our audience members. In the current political climate, are there any particular skills that you think women specifically need to develop to prepare them for leadership positions? I know, Emily, you called out earlier, it's not necessarily a talent gap, but if there are any skills that women can work on honing for leadership positions.
I'll jump in again. One of the things that we're really seeing in education is that women are much more likely to move upwards in an academic pathway, which is definitely not a bad thing. And we want to make sure, and we really support all leaders in thinking about where like their passion and their sort of cone of expertise is, and really continuing that way. I think that making sure there's a balance of the financial and operational skill set in addition is really important. Knowing that if you are leading a school, whether it's an elementary school or high school, you need to ensure that you understand the budget of that school and you're deeply involved in the annual budgeting process. And that too often we've heard women in our work saying like, oh, it's like the district CFO is really handling it. He said not to worry about it. I'm like, yes, absolutely trust and ask those questions, dig in, make sure you are developing your skill set in those areas as well. Not at all because you don't have trust in them, but because you want to make sure that at every level of leadership, you are getting exposure and building your skill set in that. Because then as you think about moving into a CAO role, into a deputy superintendent role, into that top seat, you have built that skill set the entire time and you're able to understand and really lead those fiscal discussions as you're thinking about your millions of dollar budget leading a state agency. But that starts in the beginning. So making sure that even if your pathway continues into an academic or a school-based one, you're still honing those skill sets with regards to fiscal and operational aspects, but conversely also not being pushed out of those fiscal and operational pathways if you're really interested in them. We find that men are much more tapped on the shoulder to say like, oh, would you want to be the operations manager? Which then leads to that COO, which may lead to and sort of that pathway. Putting yourself out there. We talked earlier about that risk and moving into things that, like Kristen said, you may not 100% know, but you are going to learn. Moving into those pathways, you are just as qualified as women to do that, but you're less likely to be asked. So putting yourself out and really thinking about that.
I also think, Kathleen, in this political climate, um, as women leading organizations or school districts, excuse me, we also just have to be aware of what's going on and being proactive in communicating that and creating a plan, because you do have those that in leadership positions, you are the leader, so you're leading others. So you want to make sure you're really transparent, proactive when asking questions about, how are things going to impact us long term, or how, and really trying to understand and navigate that space. So I think um, with all that's going on now, it's so important. I know for me, from an organizational standpoint, to just really be immersed in what's happening and how it impacts the future of our organization, but how it impacts those that I lead, and being transparent and open and honest and not and being okay. I think we've said this a couple of times with not having all of the answers right now. Because we don't know, like, so we don't have all of the answers, but being okay with saying that, um, and comfortable with that.
Thank you for that, Kristen and Emily. I really appreciate that about it's okay to not have all the answers. Absolutely. I believe for our last question here, I would love for you all to speak to the importance of mentorship in your career journey. How important is that, and how would you go about finding one?
I'll jump in. Like some of my mentors were men, and it was really important to have mentors, male mentors who helped me along the way. But it was really different to have male mentors and to have female mentors, because it was just a different kind of space to be able to talk to other women about like the juggle. Like, my male mentors, I don't think had to do the juggle in the same way that I had to try to figure out as a superintendent when I had young kids. And it was just super helpful to have female mentors. I say this all the time, like, ask. Like, if there's somebody you admire, ask. I'm always shocked at how few people reach out and ask. I don't think I've ever turned anybody down who's ever asked me to, like, meet with them or to help them out. And it's like such a small handful of people who do ask, that I would just really encourage you to think about, like, who's somebody that I admire, ask if you can shadow them for the day, ask if they would mind taking a call, just build the network.
Yeah, I'll jump in and I will echo all of that. I've also been very fortunate to have great mentors, both men and women. And I also often do go out of my way to not turn people down when when they reach out to me, and also to make connections for other people too, because sometimes I may not be the best mentor, and recognizing when you might not be the person that this person who reached out to you needs, but thinking about who do I know in my network that could be a great mentor for this person. And the other thing that I would say too is that mentors don't always have to be somebody who's senior to you. Like peer mentors have been instrumental in my career. And so being able to find that group, that person or that group of people who are your peers, but who might still have had different experiences, to me, in some ways, that's been even more valuable at some points in my career, not all points in my career, but definitely at some points, having that peer mentorship has really been instrumental. So I would just say to people, don't just think about people who are more senior than you and who maybe they're further along in their careers, but think about look around and see who are your peers who can play that role for you too.
Thank you both. I very much appreciate your tips and tricks on mentorship and how to find them. So thank you again to our fantastic panelists for a wonderful conversation today. Before closing the discussion, I do want to make sure everyone on the call is aware of our upcoming K-12 webinars. Our next K-12 conversation will be held on Thursday, May 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on investing in change, how education can transform the lives of incarcerated youth. We also have another one coming up in June on the BAR model, leveraging existing resources to promote student success. We will drop the registration link in the chat. We also encourage you to join us for our other Hunt Institute webinars. You can register for these discussions by going on our website, which we will post in the chat. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon.